Let's look at the difference between an observational study versus an experiment. An observational study simply observes individuals and measures variable of interest, but it does not attempt to influence the responses. The purpose of an observational study is to describe some group or situation. So, for example, over here we can see the factors linked to high blood pressure, researchers collected data on 200 patients with high blood pressure and 200 without. One thing about the observational study, as long as we choose a good sampling technique, which gives us a representative sample, so one of our random samples, we can generalize the results to our larger population. In an experiment, on the other hand, we're deliberately imposing some treatment in order to observe the response. The purpose of an experiment is to study whether the treatment causes a change in the response. So if we have a carefully designed experiment with random assignment, then we can actually show that there is a cause and effect. So that's the difference between two. Observational study allows us to generalize the results. An experiment allows us to show cause and effect. An example over here is to determine the effect of salt on blood pressure. Prisoners were randomly assigned different diets. So generally we want to know if there's a cause and effect, so why don't we always do experiment? Well, there's a lot of different reasons for that. First of all is an ethical reason oftentimes. We cannot just, put people into treatment groups and impose some sort of treatment. So generally, we need to have volunteers that volunteer for an experiment, and then we can put them into treatment groups. But again, we have to consider the ethical effect. So we cannot harm our experimental units. Now, a treatment doesn't necessarily mean that a drug treatment where we're giving a drug to our experimental units. It could be simply telling them to do something such as, do a certain diet or certain exercises 5 times a week. So it is just some sort of treatment that looks for whether that will make a change. And oftentimes we compare that with another group, which is our control group, to make sure that we wouldn't have the same results without the treatment. Let's look at an example over here. So in exercise 4, it says, recently a group of adults who swim regularly for exercise were evaluated for depression. It turned out that these swimmers were less likely to be depressed than the general population. In a second study, a group of 100 volunteers were randomly divided into 2 groups. The first group was asked to swim twice a week for 6 months. The second group did not follow an exercise plan. Which of the following is correct? So the first group was simply observed, which makes it an observational study. The second group, we divided our group into 2 different groups. One of them were asked to swim twice a week for 6 months. The other group did not follow any exercise plan. So we would call that our control group. So oftentimes within an experimental design, you will see that people are divided into different groups, at least for a good experimental design. We definitely wanted to see whether exercising will make a difference compared to the no exercise group. So this is an experimental design. Which leads us to answer B over here. And again, limitation to experiments is the ethical consideration. We cannot impose, a treatment that would cause any harm. So this is an issue with that previous study with a prisoner insult study. So make sure we are aware of that. In past exam questions, I had a question about some toxic substance. What should we do to really consider that? Should we have an observational study or an experimental design? And a lot of people said, let's do the experimental design, completely ignoring the ethical component of the question.